So we left off talking about some interesting life cycles. So we talked about the life cycle that has evolved in humans, and we talked about this other life cycle in malaria. And we talked about this as being a diploid dominant life cycle, and this as being a haploid life cycle. So the next question I want to address is why go through all of these crazy life stages, okay? Why have these life cycles evolved? Why go through all of this trouble to make egg and sperm and have these different sort of weird life stages that live in a mosquito and a human? And so there's a lot of answers to that, but part of the reason is to address and enable two key processes. Number one, fertilization. So remember, fertilization is basically an egg and a sperm coming together to double the ploidy to make a zygote. And we see that here in the human life cycle, in the general sort of animal diploid dominant life cycle. We see that also in this malaria life cycle, where we have an egg and a sperm coming together to fertilize each other to make this zygote. And so you need these different sort of life stages and life cycles to evolve to enable this fertilization to occur. And number two is for something called dispersal. And dispersal is just movement from one area to another. And the overarching idea here is, as with any of these sort of adaptations, these should enhance the overall fitness of these organisms. So being able to have fertilization, being able to disperse, should enhance the overall fitness of these organisms. So where we are in sort of the big picture of discussing reproduction over the last couple of lectures, we've talked about the definition of reproduction, some general patterns in reproduction, and in the last lecture we talked about different life cycles. And so now we're going to talk about fertilization and dispersal as important aspects of reproduction for any sort of sexually reproducing organism, and some of the adaptations that have evolved for fertilization and dispersal, and some of the costs and benefits of fertilization and dispersal and these different types of fertilization and dispersal. And so first, let's talk about the definition of these terms and also the sort of benefits of them, okay? So when we talk about fertilization, all that we're talking about is the joining of gametes, coming together of the egg and sperm to form a zygote. And recall that fertilization will double your ploidy. So if you've got you'll have haploid gametes coming together to make a diploid zygote. Or whatever sort of ploidy it's initially at, it's always going to double the ploidy when you have fertilization. And this is always going to be necessary for sexual reproduction. You can't have sexual reproduction without fertilization. And anytime that you have fertilization going on, you're talking about organisms that are reproducing sexually. And overall, it enhances genetic variation by mixing of different alleles from typically different individuals. Although occasionally, if you've got a hermaphroditic individual, you can have mixing of alleles from that same individual. Dispersal, on the other hand, is the movement or spread of offspring or other life stages to new areas. So this is just movement from one geographic location to another, dispersing, okay? And so some of the benefits of dispersal is that it allows organisms to colonize new habitats, which essentially gives them access to new resources and should reduce overall competition within that species and within that population for resources. So if there's a bunch of individuals in one place and they've eaten all the food there, a few individuals can move to a new place and get access to new food, so they're not competing with each other within that species, within that population in that particular location. It also reduces chances for inbreeding with relatives. So the idea here is that if you've got a bunch of relatives in one area, you can send out the offspring to a new place so they can meet individuals from other families, from other populations, so that you don't have as much inbreeding. And lastly, it helps offspring avoid pathogens and parasites. So this is the idea here that if you've got a bunch of individuals in a really dense population in one place and a pathogen or parasite arrives there, it's going to spread like wildfire through that really dense population. Whereas if you have a few individuals that go out and disperse to new places, they're in a completely separate location that's potentially geographically isolated from that really dense population, and so they can potentially avoid those pathogens and parasites. Okay. Which of the following is false? All right. If you said that fertilization increases genetic diversity through crossing over an independent assortment being false, that is the correct choice. That is the false statement. Remember that crossing over and independent assortment happen during meiosis, and fertilization is a distinct process that's distinct from meiosis. They go hand in hand. You can't have fertilization without meiosis. You can't have meiosis without fertilization, but fertilization itself increases genetic diversity by mixing alleles from an egg and a sperm that are potentially from different individuals, or at least have different combinations of alleles because they were produced from different, they result in different allele combinations from meiosis, okay? And so the idea here is that fertilization increases genetic diversity by mixing of alleles, not through crossing over and independent assortment, which happen independently in meiosis. The rest of those statements are all true. Okay, so we're going to explore fertilization and dispersal in sexually reproducing organisms. We're going to talk about it in animals first, and then we're going to talk about it in plants. And we're basically going to talk about some different types of fertilization and dispersal, the costs of each of these different types of fertilization and dispersal, the benefits of them, and some examples of specific adaptations that have evolved in different groups to allow these types of fertilization and dispersal to occur. So let's look at fertilization in animals. And the first type of fertilization we want to talk about is external fertilization. So external fertilization is exactly what it sounds like. Basically, sperm and egg are both released out into the environment, and fertilization occurs there, so out into the environment. And there's different types of external fertilizers. One type is called broadcast spawners. So broadcast spawners practice external fertilization. And corals are a great example of broadcast spawners. So what corals do is they'll just release a ton of sperm out into the water, and they'll release a ton of eggs out into the water. And then those eggs and sperm will meet somewhere out in the ocean floating around, and fertilization will occur. And so here you can see a picture of a coral broadcast spawning, all these sort of white things that you see floating around in the water. That's sperm being released by this coral here. So the benefits of broadcast spawning are you don't have to move to find a mate. You can just sit in one place, release your sperm or your eggs out into the environment, and let them do their thing. Much easier in terms of the cost of finding a mate. However, there are a lot of costs associated with external fertilization and broadcast spawners. Specifically, there's a lower probability of successful fertilization. So the chance of an egg and a sperm meeting each other are way lower than it would be if you had sort of like internal fertilization like we see in human beings, okay? So there's a lower probability of an egg and a sperm finding each other when you're just throwing them out there into the environment. And there's also a larger energetic investment in making tons of sperm and tons of eggs. So you need to make way more of it because it's got way lower odds of finding an egg or sperm out there. And so you've got to make a ton of it to release out in the environment to increase the odds that some of them happen to run into each other. Another big cost is that this is typically limited to aquatic environments, okay? And that's because egg and sperm don't have a lot of adaptations to stop themselves from drying out in animals. And so you need a moist or typically an aquatic environment for those egg and sperm to be able to float around to meet each other. Otherwise, they're going to dry out, and otherwise they're not going to be able to sort of move around in the medium far enough to find each other. Okay, so if we talk about some of the adaptations that we see in broadcast spawners that practice external fertilization, oftentimes we'll see receptors to detect specific environmental cues to synchronize the timing of the release of eggs and sperm. So you want to make sure that everybody's releasing a bunch of eggs at the same time that everybody's releasing a bunch of sperm to increase the probability that they're going to find each other, okay? And so there'll often be either some sort of chemoreceptors or photoreceptors to detect sort of the right time of year to release your eggs and sperm. And this is what we'll see. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this, maybe if you've gone on a tropical vacation, but you can see this sort of pinkish tone in the water here, and you can get a better look at it here. This is basically the synchronous timing of the release of eggs and sperm by coral that's based on a lunar cycle. And so they'll release a ton of sperm all at the same time, and so much sperm, in fact, that it'll change the color of the water. And so you can see right here, it's done exactly that. We've got the sort of pink color from all the eggs and sperm in the water because of this synchronous release. So the next type of fertilization I want to talk about is a different type of external fertilization that's called non-broadcast spawners, okay? So once again, with external fertilization, you have the sperm and egg both released into the environment, and fertilization occurs in the environment. But with non-broadcast spawners, basically they'll find each other and they'll release their egg and sperm at the same time right on top of each other, okay? And so we see this in frogs, we see this in fish. Fish, they have externalization, so here you have the female, here you have the male. The male's releasing a bunch of sperm, the female's right next to him releasing a bunch of eggs, and those eggs are being fertilized by that sperm to produce young fry or new fish. Same deal with frogs. You've got a female here, the male's gripped on her back, and basically the male releases a bunch of sperm, the female releases a bunch of eggs, and this will usually be in a moist environment or directly into the water. The sperm will fertilize the eggs, and those eggs will develop into tadpoles and eventually frogs. So once again, this is called non-broadcast spawners because they're sort of putting their sperm and eggs in one spot instead of just shooting them out all over the place and hoping they find an egg or a sperm out there. And so the obvious benefits of this is that there's an increased probability of successful fertilization, and also there's way less investment in making tons of sperm. So you don't have to make as much sperm, you don't have to make as many eggs, you don't have to make as many gametes in general. You still want to make a lot, of course, but you don't need to make as many as you would if you're a broadcast spawner because you have a higher probability of them finding each other. Now, the costs of this, in turn, are that you have to find and attract mates. So you've got to find them in the first place, then you got to convince them that they want to breed with you. Oftentimes, there's a lot of competition to breed because you need to be in close proximity with it. The males and the females need to be in close proximity with each other. There's also been a lot of fighting to be able to breed, and so that's called competition. And you can see that here in this mating ball where you've got one female in the middle and a bunch of males all sort of fighting for the opportunity to fertilize her eggs. And oftentimes, this is once again limited to aquatic or moist environments, and that's because these egg and sperm will dry out if they're not in they don't have things to stop them from drying out, so they need to be in a moist environment or typically an aquatic environment. And we see lots of interesting structural adaptations for this. So there's so many out there, it's too numerous to even list, but I just want to give you one example of a structural adaptation. And remember, a structural adaptation is just a sort of physical morphological adaptation that organisms have to aid in this type of external fertilization. And one thing that we see are nuptial pads in frogs. And so if you look at this male frogs often have these sort of nuptial pads that are on their thumb. So if you look at this hand right here, you can see right here it's got this sort of thickened skin on its thumb that helps him to grip way better into the female. And if you do a real close-up on that, you can see that it's got all these tiny little sort of spikes and barbs, and it almost acts like Velcro to help him grip onto her really strong so she can't buck him off, and he can stay on there to fight off any other males that try to kick him off and also ensure that his sperm will meet her eggs. And if you look at her chest, you can see these little spots where he kind of rubbed her raw from those nuptial pads. And if you look further, even closer into these nuptial pads, you can see these little glands right here. Some male frogs will actually release sticky secretions that can help them stick to the frog and also act as sedatives and aphrodisiacs to help sort of facilitate the process. In other words, they'll sort of drug the female a little bit to help convince her to breed. And we'll also see behavioral adaptations. So remember, behavioral adaptations are just behaviors that help to, in this case, enhance the probability of fertilization. And frogs breeding and calling is one great example of this. So you've often heard frogs calling before, I'm sure. The whole idea behind that whole ribbit and ribbit is to attract a female, let her know that a male's here, and it's only the males that call so that they can sort of bring her in and reproduce. So the next type of fertilization that I want to talk about is internal fertilization. So internal fertilization is fertilization that occurs inside one of the parents, okay? And it's usually inside of the female who receives sperm from the male to fertilize her eggs that she keeps internal, okay? And there's a couple different examples of this. So we can have internal fertilization in the form of spermatophores, which we see in salamanders, where essentially a male will drop this sort of sperm packet, and this is sort of a close-up view of that, but it's basically a little packet of sperm that he then has to convince the female to come and pick up, and then she'll be internally fertilized. You can also have just straight-up sperm implantation, where the male will implant sperm directly into the female. And this is typically what we see in fully terrestrial animals, so things like reptiles, things like mammals and humans, things like birds, and also terrestrial invertebrates. Now, The benefits of having internal fertilization is, of course, you have an increased probability of successful fertilization. If you have the sperm implanted directly into the female, they have a much better odds of the sperm finding the eggs and fertilizing those eggs. And now, of course, there's less investment in making tons of sperm, way less sperm being need to made than we see in some of the externally fertilizing species of organisms. And also, gametes are way less susceptible to drying out and dying. And so this is really the type of fertilization that we see most often in terrestrial animals on land. So the sperm and the egg are not typically very exposed to the environment, except for maybe in the case of spermatophores. But with sperm implantation, everything's able to stay very moist because it's not exposed to the environment. Now, the costs, of course, are that once again, you've got to find and attract mates. There's a lot of competition to breed, and you often need structures to help insert and accept gametes, okay? And so some of the structural adaptations that we might see are things like in snakes. They have these things called hemipenes, like you see right here, that if you sort of avert them or get them outside of a snake, this is what they look like, and this is what males use to implant sperm into female snakes. And so they have these very elaborate sort of setups to implant their sperm into the female snake. Or like we see in barnacles, they actually have the largest penis relative to body size of any organism on Earth, where their penis can be up to 12 times longer than their body size. And this is essentially because they're stuck in one place, but they still practice internal fertilization. The penis has to find a female to implant its sperm in. And so it'll reach out and sort of feel around and find a female to fertilize. We also have behavioral adaptations, and we often see some of the most elaborate behavioral adaptations in organisms that practice internal fertilization. So, for example, salamanders can practice very elaborate mating dances where they'll sort of do a dance for a female and try to actually share some pheromones with her in order to convince her to pick up this little spermatophore thing. Or in birds, particularly bowerbirds, we can see these very elaborate sort of nests and dances have evolved to convince a female that their sperm is worthy and for a female to take that sperm implantation. Okay, which of the following is false? All right, if you said fish and frogs are an example of non-broadcast spawners with internal fertilization, that would be the false statement. They have external fertilization, where the male releases the sperm onto the female's eggs. These other two statements are true. Let's try the next one. Which of the following is correct? All right, if you said that decreased dependence on water is a benefit of internal fertilization, that is the correct statement. So remember, internal fertilization is most common in terrestrial animals from dry habitats. That's because external fertilization, the egg and sperm in animals, will typically dry out. Broadcast spawners typically produce more gametes than non-broadcast spawners, and that's because they got to produce a ton to let out into the environment to increase the probability that an egg will find a sperm. Finding and attracting mates is a cost for broadcast spawners. That's not true. That's really a cost for non-broadcast spawners and internal fertilizers. They're the ones that have to go and find mates. Broadcast spawners don't need to go and find and attract mates. They can just send all their sperm and egg out without having to deal with that. All right, so the last thing that I want to talk about is dispersal, which remember is the movement or spread of offspring to new areas. So let's talk about dispersal first off in animals. So when we talk about dispersal in animals, animals are really the masters of dispersal. They are the masters of movement. They've evolved so many different ways to disperse from one way to another. And so dispersal often is not a very big issue to overcome with animals, just because they already have so many adaptations, whether it's flying, swimming, sort of jet propulsion like we see in octopi and squids, crawling, slithering, brachiating, flying in insects, gliding, and even some frogs and hopping. So they're really good at dispersing from one place to another and have a ton of adaptations to do that. However, we also see adaptations in some of the less mobile stages of animals that have evolved specialized life stages for dispersal. So we talked about all the different ways that dispersal is important. And we have some sort of organisms, like, for example, an adult sea urchin that has this larval stage that's a mobile stage that can basically catch currents in the ocean to move around from one spot to another when this urchin doesn't really move much or move far. So that aids in dispersal. We also, if you think of jellyfish, In fact, jellyfish are just one life stage that's a special life stage in the dispersal of polyps. Okay, so a jellyfish is the life stage that you see right here that's called the medusae life stage of a typical polyp. So these will produce egg and sperm to make another swimming larval life stage, which will attach to a substrate and can't move around and makes this polyp thing. And this is how a jellyfish will actually live most of its life, is this polyp stage. But eventually it will produce this little medusa bud that produces little baby jellyfish that grow up into big jellyfish that move around. And once again, the jellyfish is actually just one life stage, evolved especially for dispersal of this non-mobile life stage. Okay, so here we see examples of some less mobile animals that have evolved specialized life stages just for dispersal. Okay, which of the following, A through D, are not reasons that fertilization and dispersal enhance fitness? All right. If you said C and D are the correct choices, that is right. So remember, fertilization enhances genetic variation not by increasing rates of mutation, but through mixing of alleles. And that dispersal does not increase competition for resources. It decreases competition for resources within a species or population because it allows individuals to move to an area where there's fewer individuals to compete with. And they can get access to new resources and get out of those really dense areas where a lot of the resources have been consumed. And these other two choices are, of course, correct or true. All right, so the last thing is I will challenge you guys, or we challenge you guys to test your knowledge of the past few slides by completing this table about animals and external broadcast spawners, external fertilizing non-broadcast spawners, internal fertilization and dispersal, talk about the costs and benefits of each of these general types of fertilization and also dispersal, talk about some of the adaptations that organisms have evolved to do these types of fertilization and dispersal, and give me an example organism for each.